Well, good morning or good evening, depending on what time zone you're connecting in from. Thank you so much for joining today for this webinar on the topic of Atlassian governance best practices. My name is Dietmar Doerschlag. I'm an Atlassian certified business consultant with Valiantys. I am connecting in from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Jokingly, we refer to Vancouver as being in the southwest of Canada. I'm just north of the Washington state line, about 3 hours north of Seattle. And I am really excited to have you with me today to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to me, and that is how you would properly govern an Atlassian ecosystem, something that is really, really important to me personally, as I've been dealing with governance for many, many years. On this slide, you also see Bonnie. Bonnie is a very valued team member, a colleague of mine. She's unfortunately traveling today. She's with a client in Toronto, and she sends her regrets that she cannot be here today. So thank you again for being here. I'm really looking forward to spending this next hour with you. So many of you know who Valiantys is. I just want to introduce ourselves real quick. Valiantys, we are a Atlassian Platinum partner. We are one of the largest partners globally in the Atlassian ecosystem, and we are really 100% focused on the Atlassian ecosystem. And what we're really doing is we're doing business transformation work using the Atlassian tools. We have many, many different clients of all shapes and industries and sizes. For example, over 65 Fortune 500 companies are our customers. We also have, of course, many small and medium-sized organizations that we work with as well. And in all those engagements that we work on with various clients, obviously the topic of governance always comes up. Now, my background in my entire career in IT has always been working on projects, programs, initiatives that introduce change, mainly on full cycle system implementation initiatives. And in those roles as a project manager, program manager, of course, the topic of governance always comes up. And this is a topic that's very near and dear to me. And this is why I'm really excited to talk about this topic with you today. So why do we care? Why is governance really important? Let me maybe frame this from a personal perspective. As a project manager, I'm obviously very vested in managing any initiative successfully to a go live. We want to be on time, on budget, and we want to delight our users with a great tool that they will be using. That is a very important focus, but it is obviously a very time-limited focus because the great solutions that we put in will be hopefully sustained over many, many years to come. And our horizon, looking at those systems, need to be long-term. And this is really where the topic of governance, decision-making to keep the systems that we put in an optimal state, this is where the topic of governance really comes in. We have to really look at the long term. Governance is so much about the clarity of roles and responsibilities, decision making, how you keep the system that you implemented really in an optimal state so you get optimal value out of those systems. Now, governance is not the same as government, obviously, right? You will experience governance in your personal life. If you walk into a school board meeting, you obviously will be dealing with governance, right? There is a governance framework, decisions that are being made that are based on a governance model. If you are part of any community, a church, a club, all of that is based on governance, right? So when we talk about governance, you are obviously dealing with governance, not only in your private life, also in your professional life. So on this slide are some of the topics we want to cover in this webinar. What is governance? What is it all about? And why should we care in the context of the Atlassian ecosystem? And who really needs to be involved when we talk about governance? And if you don't have a governance framework in place yet, how do you even get started putting it in? And then we're also going to do a demo where we show you lots of artifacts that we as Valiantys work with our clients. So what is governance? Digest this definition for a moment. Governance is all about decision making, right? It's the process of decision making, enforcing decisions in an organization or a society. This is what governance is really all about. So on the slide are a number of pillars that we're looking at: people, processes or practices, and tools. Those three things come together when we talk about governance. Now, the most important aspect, in my opinion, when we talk about governance is people. You always first look at the people who are involved. And then you look at the practices, the processes that keep the systems alive, right? You look at people first, and then you look at the processes and the practices that need to be in place. And then, of course, we look at the tools, and you look at the specifics as to what people need to be doing, what processes should be applied to keep the systems that we implement, the entire Atlassian ecosystem in a solid, in an optimal state. On the best practices here, I want to zoom in on the first bullet. We're talking about representative decision making. This is really, really important. So we work with a lot of clients who use Atlassian tools, whether or not this is Jira Service Management, or Confluence, sometimes in large organizations that represent multiple varied user groups. And of course, everyone has their own perspective, their own opinion. I previously worked in a fairly large organization, about 8,000 employees. It was a mass transit agency here in Vancouver. And we had a parent company, and we had 3 operating entities. They all had their own executive team. They even had their own board. And of course, they had their own functions: finance, human resources, etc. Now, they all have their own interests. So when we talk about governance, it's really important that we talk about representative decision making, that everybody's interests are properly represented in your governance framework. The second bullet is also really important. We need to apply a holistic system thinking approach. Many of you probably have more than one Atlassian tool in place. We see organizations that start with Jira and Confluence. Some of you on the call work with me on an implementation right now where you implement Jira Service Management on top of Atlassian tools that are already in place: Jira, Confluence. So we cannot look at one system in an isolated manner. We need to look at it holistically, right? We need to really apply a holistic approach. And lastly, but very important, is this process of intentional change management. And that speaks to, I think, 2 aspects of change management: the systems and the people. So when you make a change in your Atlassian ecosystem, the change needs to be assessed, needs to be approved, needs to be properly implemented. And of course, all of this is based on a governance framework. But we also talk about the people that are part of that change, right? I refer to this as organizational change management, where we always need to look at the people that are part of the changes that you're implementing. So those are some aspects to get our thinking as to what governance is and why it is so important. So why do we care, and why should you care about governance? Now, governance really deeply affects your organization. At the end of the day, when we implement systems, you always need to think about, how do I position myself to get true value out of the investment, right? And governance, and you will probably hear me saying this a few times in the next hour, the absence of governance really creates chaos. So to get true value out of the investment that we put in, so pushing towards that go live, you need to have a governance framework in place that you maintain that value over the long run. And this is why we should not only focus on a go live, on turning a great solution that we build on, we need to focus on how do you actually sustain the momentum so you can continue getting that value out of that investment. Organizations sometimes struggle to do that, right? Some organizations we work with struggle to get ongoing value out of the systems. And we really need to therefore focus on the long-term decision-making framework that you continue to get benefits and value from your systems. So this is why we should really care. Of course, governance also very much means that you have executive visibility, right, into how the systems that are so critical are governed and kept in a great state. So this is why we should really all care about governance. Now, let me bring up a slide that might surprise you in this governance webinar. And disclaimer, this is not my garage, but some people who know me know that I am very passionate about being out in the outdoors, climbing. And this picture to me speaks to what? It speaks to chaos, right? This is all the equipment that you would need when you go on a mountain climb, just shoved in the corner in a garage. If your Atlassian system implementation looks like that 3 months after go live, we probably need to think about how we can properly govern the Atlassian ecosystem. So this really speaks to, I think, to chaos, and this is obviously not a recommended approach for implementing systems. Now, let me go to the next slide. This looks very different, right? So what you have on the right is yours truly, 1970s. I'm not the youngest guy any longer. On a rock climbing trip with my dad, and yes, he took me up there with proper governance in place. There was lots of planning. There was preparation. There was proper equipment brought. So this was, yes, exciting. Was it risky? To a certain degree, but we thought it out, we planned it out, and I refer to this as governance, right? So you have everything planned out. You leave nothing to chances. Of course, the unforeseen risks can pop up, but you really plan things out. You don't leave it to chances. And I think when we invest lots of time, lots of effort into putting Atlassian systems in place, no matter what those systems are, Confluence, JSM, Jira, we should, just as we do in our personal life, we should really think about the decision-making framework that we put in place so you keep those systems in a great state and you really continue to get good value out of those systems. So there is what we refer to as a hidden cost of system chaos, right? The highlighted text here that sometimes organizations underestimate the impact of poor data hygiene because the costs are diffuse and incremental. So think about your own organization. If you have maybe a lack of governance in place, right? There's some of the risks or impacts here on this slide that ring true for you. So let's look at, for example, brand reputation. Let's just say you put a really good service desk in place, one space that I really work in a lot. And that's your entry door into your organization, right? That really represents your brand. But then the system is optimally built and then it's not being kept up to date. It's not tuned. There's no effort put in place to optimize it over the long run. Now, this can then, of course, if customers come onto your GSM portal and they cannot find what they need, and maybe knowledge base articles are out of date, are irrelevant, that could really affect your brand reputation, right? So there is a hidden cost that's sometimes not easily quantifiable that comes from a lack of governance, right? Now, this report, Valiantys did this report, is available. We can provide this to you. Brianna, who is hosting this webinar with me, can put the link to this report into the chat, and you can digest this at your own time. But this is very, very relevant information. Now, when we look at the importance of governance, let me just talk briefly about this slide, and this is from the same report as well. The other aspect of when governance is lacking is that you really might miss out on seizing on opportunities that are out there, right? Because you're so much focused on maybe firefighting, right? On reducing your internal cost, maybe because the systems are not working the way they should be. And so you're really missing that strategic opportunity, right? That strategic opportunity that you cannot seize on because your effort is fixed on, is focused on firefighting, right? In other words, if you spend a lot of time doing things that maybe you shouldn't be doing, you're doing them maybe because governance is absent, that prevents you from focusing on the value add market opportunities out there. So this is a funny slide or scary slide. So we refer to this as the Jira Hall of Fame. Yes, we have come across of organizations where those data points are actually true. 870 issue types. Atlassian now, as we all know, refers to them as work item types. Over 3,000 custom fields, over 4,000 workflows, super complicated workflows with dozens and dozens of statuses, right? Many schemes. All of us who work in Atlassian ecosystem are very familiar with the term of schemes, right? Issue types schemes, issue type screen schemes, field schemes, workflow schemes. It can get very, very unruly, right? Organizations that have over 100 or actually over 200 admins, too many cooks in the kitchen. So if any of this, what you see here, maybe not as drastic, rings true for you, then you really need to think about governance, because then you are at risk that the system might dive into a state of disrepair, and you really need to look at governance. We refer to the lack of governance also as wild west symptoms. And before I move on, I'm maybe sounding a little bit negative. There is obviously a lot of encouraging content in my webinar in a few minutes here, but we want to just lay out what some of the symptoms are that we see when governance is not properly given the attention that it should. Some of the things here, in no particular order, right? You have maybe a workflow in place that has not clearly defined statuses. One of my favorite is how do you spell canceled? Is this with one L or two L's? There's a debate between Canadians and Americans, I understand, right? How many custom fields do you use, right? What's the process of controlling what custom fields are set up, right? Now, the third bullet is interesting. As you move to the last status in your workflow, what's the definition of done, right? Bonnie told me, and I thought it was really, really funny. She said that she had a client who implemented a status called done. Seriously, done. They wanted to really make sure that we have it done, so they created a status called done. So if you see some symptoms here, right, of what we refer to as wild west configurations, where the system has obviously gotten a little bit unruly. And that might not manifest itself at go live. Those who work with me would know that, of course, I would never agree to putting a done status in place. But if you might have too many cooks in the kitchen, figuratively speaking, over the long run, a system can then really, over the long run, dive into more a status of unruliness and wild west symptoms. So this is why we are really passionate about this topic. So now, having laid the not so good news about what can happen when governance is missing, well, let's move into what we should actually be doing. How do you get started to stand up an Atlassian governance framework? Now, you read the term on board here, right? That's a very formal term. You can use whatever term you want in your organization. That's really inconsequential. Some organizations call it steering committee, some call it board, others call it steering group. Whatever you want to call it, that's really not that important. But what you do is you put a group together, and we talk about what this means here, that is really tasked with governing the entire Atlassian ecosystem. Now, you might ask, well, who should be involved in that committee or that governance group? I mean, that greatly depends on your organization. Not coincidentally, the first role that we mention here is the product owner. And of course, coming from a Scrum world, big proponent of Agile, that's obviously a Scrum Agile term, right? The product owner represents the interests of the product. You need to have someone who owns the Atlassian ecosystem, right? There could be multiple owners. There could be a Jira owner, a GSM owner, a Confluence owner. But certainly the membership of that Atlassian governance board needs to include the Atlassian product owner. Also very important, of course, you want to have your admins as part of this governance board as well, right? Product admins, Jira, GSM, Confluence, and certainly what we call the org admin in the cloud, the person that handles licensing, user management, groups, installing apps, or et cetera, et cetera. But one thing I'm really passionate about is the third bullet. This speaks to the topic of representative decision making. If you have the Atlassian tools used in multiple departments, maybe across a large organization in different divisions, think about who the representatives are that represent those business units, right? Should a governance committee only include IT? I personally would have some hesitations about that. I certainly would advocate for having business representatives as part of a governance committee or board, whatever you call it, that represent the business interests. They need to be obviously not super tech savvy, but they need to be able to provide meaningful input to a technology platform. Now, what does the governance committee or group actually do? And later on, I will actually show you some very concrete examples. The first thing is they set the vision and the goal, the rules of engagement for that board, right? Like they set the terms of reference. What do we do? Why do we exist? What are our goals? And let's also define specifically the practices of how that governance committee, governance board works, right? They, of course, set the scope of their responsibility, and they would also define, very important, the support models, right? And they also identify all the systems that are in scope in the Atlassian governance framework, right? This could be, needless to say, core Atlassian apps, Jira, JSM, Confluence, Trello, Bitbucket, whatever you have in place, but certainly would include also marketplace apps that are integrated into the Atlassian products. And this speaks to the holistic system thinking approach, right? And they also identify and maintain and control the overall system architecture, right? So if there are significant changes proposed to the system architecture, integration points with other systems, internal or external, the board, that governance committee is tasked with really controlling that and really owning that piece, right? And the last bullet is, of course, if you have read the Phoenix project book, one of my favorite books as an IT professional, highly recommend. You will certainly be reminded how important it is to have a solid change control process in place that controls how changes are being proposed, approved, and implemented in the Atlassian ecosystem. So this gives you an idea as the first step, right? You're standing up a governance board, call it whatever you want, and it gives you some context as to what this board does. Now, how do you get started, right? So you start really by defining the goals, right? And the goals are very specific to your organization, right? So I'm currently working with a client on a Jira JSM actually health check assessment, and that organization has significant growth plans through the acquisition of other organizations. So one of the governance principles and goals for that organization obviously would be scalable growth, right? So they need to think about a governance framework that allows them to scale the system up to, in their case, a global presence, right? Maybe another key goal is that you want to have really visible controls in place. I'm thinking about another great client I'm working with right now, where we are thinking a lot about a change control process that we're building in JSM that has to be auditable, right? So you have visible controls in place. So when internal audit comes in, we can answer as to who approved the change, when was it approved, and on what basis was the change approved, right? But other goals could be knowledge sharing, right? Like how do you set up tools like Confluence or even Jira, JSM to properly share knowledge that you create in the organization? So it starts with defining the goals that you have in your organization using the Atlassian tools. And then it is also, suffice to say, establishing a clear governance vision and the governance purpose. You want to ensure, let me just read out this real quick, you want to ensure ongoing balance between the enterprise goals, so what are the goals in your organization, right? But also flexible controls managed by employees. In other words, you don't want to put the system in place that is so overburdening to users that they will likely find a way to work around the controls. I could give you many examples in my IT life where users were able to do that. You want to be flexible, yet ensuring enterprise goals are being met. So here are some of the architectural decisions, right? That you would make in your organization. And the slide here represents more the Jira life or the Jira aspects, but of course this could be very much the case also in JSM, right? So the governance committee, governance group has to make architectural decisions, right? What is a project for starters? Projects, by the way, will be called spaces going forward. which of course makes us curious what Confluence spaces will be called. But first and foremost, you need to decide from a governance perspective what constitutes a project in Jira and a project in JSM. Like, how do you define a project? And how do you layer up from a project to something that sits above the project, right? So you have a hierarchy of scale and a hierarchy of different layers in your ecosystem. And that is a very important architectural decision that you have to make that has far-reaching impacts and that your governance group has to wrestle with and control. The scope of responsibility, right? As with everything in life, you need to put a box around the scope, right? The governance group, committee, board, what is the scope of responsibility? Where are the boundaries, right? What are the connection points up to where does that governance framework reach out? That's really important to wrestle with, right? And you really want to have a very sound topology of your data architecture from top to bottom. So these are some of the very important architectural decisions that your governance committee has to wrestle with. So these are some thoughts on why governance is really important. What are some of the pitfalls that we see when governance is not in place? Now, before I move into an actual demo and show you how we approach governance when we work with our clients, I want to share a quick real story. So between September last year and March this year, a colleague of mine and I were privileged to work with a great US client with locations from coast to coast. And we implemented Jira Service Management, moving them off ServiceNow. Large organization with many teams. And the scope of what we did included about 20 different teams. It was really enterprise service management, IT, human resources, facilities, marketing, and many other functions. And the solution we built was heavily focused on automations. There's actually a video on our YouTube channel, which Brianna, if you find it, can pull it up. It talks about enterprise service management and how we built out that solution. And the solution was complex. We documented the solution in handover videos that we shared with our customer. And the solution was thoroughly tested. I had hundreds of test issues in my test project. And we went live. It was a resounding success, 0 defects. Our contract ended about a month later, and then we moved on. And the organization had hired just recently a new Jira administrator. And that Jira administrator was, of course, very eager to help and very well-intentioned. And that Jira administrator went into the application, into Jira, and started deleting some custom fields, not knowing, even though we had, of course, emphasized this in our handover videos, that the automations, of which there were dozens, were based on that custom field. And we then got a frantic email from their senior IT leader asking us why the solution broke. And we said, well, it worked perfectly when we went live. And we then jumped on a call and very quickly found out what the culprit was. So this example obviously speaks to a certain lack of governance, right? Where somebody did something that was well-intentioned, but it had significant consequences. Now, compare that to another customer. It was a global client. They are in the food delivery business, very well-known brand. And they had a very different governance approach. When we worked with them, we were decidedly, as consultants, not given the permission of organizational admins, which very often we do have with our clients. We were just given the role of Jira, GSM project admins, which was fine for us. And we needed a few custom fields to be created. And of course, if I'm not a Jira admin, we all know I cannot create a custom field. You need to be a Jira admin. So they had a governance process in place where you had to submit a ticket, a request to submit a request for a new custom field. And on first thought, I thought, wow, that's real bureaucratic. But then a few months later, when we had the chaos with the other customer, I was reminded that that decision that they made, that governance decision that they made, was actually a really solid decision, that they recognized the importance of how things can break if you just innocently delete custom fields, and they wanted to lock that down. And that really speaks to the presenting this from a Confluence page, and try it out. Confluence is awesome. You can go into presentation mode and do like a slide presentation mode right out of Confluence. So I want to take you to our Atlassian governance board. So this is from a client demo site that we created, and this is what we work with when we engage with clients, when we talk about governance and when we help them to build up a strong governance framework. So this is the Atlassian governance board, right? So here the term was just used, board. Again, choose whatever name works in your organization. And what we have here is we define first and foremost what the board, the committee, the group's mission is, right? And you see some suggested text there. Why do they exist? It's always the most important question to ask. Why do they exist? What is their mission, right? That's the first thing you define, right? And then of course, the governance board also elaborates on, well, how often do we meet? Should we meet monthly? That might be sufficient in your organization. Or if you have a lot of churn, a lot of changes that are being proposed, maybe you want to have a biweekly cadence of meeting, right? So a governance board defines its mission, and then it also defines the cadence of meetings, right? And of course, what is the agenda and who controls the agenda when the committee meets. So this is sort of the home page in the governance framework that we work on with our clients, right? So when you now see here a number of topics that we elaborate on, and I want to zoom into those topics. We talk about governance practices. So the practices that you would define in how you run governance in your Atlassian ecosystem, right? We have lots of content related to Atlassian administration, and we have content related to knowledge base. So let's start with knowledge base. So let me say the first one thing. When I moved into the Atlassian space, I was really impressed with Atlassian's resources that they provide online. I think it's fabulous. They're doing a really good job, and I want to give them a good shout out for all the documentation that they put together. We work in the cloud. You have probably heard an important announcement earlier this week that Atlassian gave notice that on a 3-year runway, they are no longer supporting data center. That was a big announcement, and they give clients 3 years to move off data center and into the cloud. And cloud, of course, is constantly changing. I'm teaching Jira boot camps on a regular basis, and I can promise you, whenever I spin up a new training instance, I am very likely finding something that wasn't there just 6 weeks earlier. Especially now, the user interface is rapidly changing. So don't attempt to recreate content that Atlassian provides for free that is likely going to be updated very soon because the user interface and the functionality changes. Don't waste your time on that. Rather, based on the products that you have, the apps that you have in your organization, just bring in um, um, helpful content, whatever that is, from Atlassian directly, right? There is great content online. Talk about project categories, enterprise project categories, right? Category templates, team project categories, all that kind of stuff. Atlassian documentation and videos, right? Don't waste your time recreating content that is readily available for free online. But there are certain, of course, company-specific decisions that you have to document, suffice to say, right? How you architected the system, right? Uh, Sprint naming conventions, right? There are certain things that you certainly have to document because they're specific to your organization, right? What custom fields are you using and what are they used for? So one key aspect that you look at from a governance perspective is to create this library of knowledge, right? Broken down by probably, we organize this, as you see here, by products. So here pages for Confluence and Jira, right? Whatever works for you. Now, the second topic is, of course, Atlassian administration. Brianna can maybe go to our YouTube channel and can paste the link to a YouTube playlist where I recorded a series of, I think, 9 videos on the various roles of what the various types of Atlassian admins do, from the org admin to the different product admins to the project admins, space admins. And of course, what you want to do from a governance perspective, you want to write this all out, right? You want to write out how your administration works. On the topic of administration, let me make the following statement, which might possibly surprise you. A rule of thumb is that you should have one admin for every 300 to 500 users. So when we work with organizations that have 1,000 users and we see 20 admins, we say, well, that's too many cooks in the kitchen, because those admins are very powerful and can do a lot of different things. So you really want to think through who are your admins and what are they empowered to do. And sometimes less is better. So you document everything what the admins do, from naming conventions. You certainly want to document your run books, right? When you create a new Jira project or a new JSM project, even more consequential, that's a big decision. And you want to really create a run book where you outline how that is being done, right? This is very important to think through. You wouldn't just give anyone the ability to create a new project in Jira JSM, because that's a very consequential decision. So run books, documenting run books under Atlassian administration is really, really important. And the last topic, of course, that the governance board elaborates on are your governance practices, right? In no particular order, you need to elaborate on your decision-making process, right? You need to document the decisions that you made. Why did you agree on a certain Jira architecture, right? Why did you agree on certain global configuration settings? If you change certain global configurations, that could have significant impact, right? So those governance practices are really, really important, right? Decision logs, you focus on your enablement and training model, right? One thing that I'm very passionate about is, what is the support model? If we go live, who supports the applications that we put in the day after go live? And are those support people properly enabled that they can provide the support to mission critical systems. So these are some of the really important governance practices that you want to have in place. So this is a very quick rundown on our Atlassian governance board, right? When we work with clients in governance engagements, this is what we bring in. And you obviously see that there is a lot of thought behind this. Suffice to say, you are tailoring this to the needs of your organization. The way you set up governance in an organization with 50 users obviously would be very different for an organization with 5,000 users. So let's wrap it up with a few closing slides, and then we can go into Q&A. Just want to talk about this slide here very quickly. Need to scroll down again, my apologies. So this slide is interesting, and we call it data is the new gold. Why is that? Now, obviously, we don't live in the USB stick era any longer. I still have one, but that's not that common. It's all in the cloud now. But the principle here is, of course, still very relevant, right? Well, the emphasis here that I'd like on this slide is it's all about predictable outcomes with a consistent approach. So let me elaborate on this. When I was privileged to build up and then manage a pretty sizable project management office, I worked a lot with senior leaders, both in the business and in IT, that were represented on multiple steering committees, right? We had 40 or so projects in our portfolio. And I remember my director went from committee to committee to committee. And he said, well, hang on a second. I don't want to go to a committee at 9 a.m. and the PM reports in a completely different manner from the PM in the committee in the afternoon. I want it to be done consistently. So of course, we created a consistent process with consistent use of templates, right? So if I translate this experience into the Atlassian world, senior leaders need insights. They need insights to make decisions. So we're building dashboards. And the dashboards are obviously only as good as the data that feeds the dashboards. If you're measuring SLAs in JSM, time to first response, time to resolution, that of course depends on how users cycle a work item through to completion. So you need to have a consistent approach to provide meaningful data and meaningful insight for your decision makers. This is what this is really all about. And you cannot do that unless you have a solid governance framework in place. Last slide before we open it up for Q&A. How can we help you? I just want to say that we are very passionate about governance. I have in my own IT career seen both the good, the great, but unfortunately also the bad and the ugly, right? I have seen the absence of governance really having a potential to create a chaos. And that doesn't have to be that way. If you're properly positioning yourself with thoughts about how do I actually keep that important ecosystem with Atlassian, that investment, how do I keep that in a solid state so I can reap the benefits, the values, you have a much calmer sailing ahead. So the way we can help is we do governance boot camps, not very different from the JSM and Jira boot camps that we're teaching. JSM is 2 days, Jira is a 3-day hands-on boot camp. This is a focused 1-day hands-on boot camp that we're teaching. if you would be interested in that, contact us. You can reach me on LinkedIn. You can certainly find information on our website. We would be delighted to work with you and find out if you need any help in the topic of governance. And lastly, the materials that I shared is what we do when we work in clients in a little bit of longer engagement, right? So depending on the size of the organization, we do a 2 to 4 month engagement where we have lots of workshops and conversations and really help organizations to position themselves for success with governance. So that's the content for today, and I just really want to thank you for being here and having spent the time with me on this webinar. So I'm just looking at the questions. We would be delighted to give you the contents on the governance board if we work with you in a governance engagement. There's obviously a lot of effort that was put into that, but there's so much IP on that we cannot just share it out. But we would be absolutely delighted to work with you in an engagement and dive into the details. So if you're interested in that, please let us know. Okay, looking at questions. One question that came up is, how do you actually rescue bad governance? So you have an organization, I think is the question, where governance was not thought through, it's not really working well, and how do you actually get out of that pickle? What do you do? Bonnie, who I really respect, she has been doing this governance webinar with me a few times. She always says that, well, the first step is that you always admit that something isn't working. I think it's a very valid statement. You need to then admit, well, we have a problem and now let's commit to actually resolving it, right? And then of course you need to dive in and say, well, what's not working? You need to assess it. So you would really look at the current framework that's in place of decision making. Maybe the status is there is no framework in place. You need to then really assess it, right? What are the specifics on what is wrong? And then from that, you roll up your sleeves. It's not overnight, and then you really define what the future state should look like from a decision-making process. I personally would get some very keen and switched on people in the room, people that are knowledgeable and passionate to do good things, and put the proposal together. One thing I'd like to emphasize is from my personal experience is that governance needs to be driven from senior leadership. Let me give an example. We were brought into an organization to do a Jira health check assessment. And I actually worked my heart out on that engagement. We produced a very solid, comprehensive report and recommendation. But what I noticed was that senior leadership was not really present for whatever reason. They were obviously respectfully saying there are many, many things going on. But the person who led that engagement on the client side was fairly junior in their organization. And I noticed that there was not really senior leadership driving the outcomes, which included a governance framework proposal. And I think it never really took off because it wasn't driven by senior leadership. So you want to have senior leaders committing to the journey of solid governance. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Anything when it comes to governance that we should avoid? I touched on that already briefly. The analogy of having too many cooks in the kitchen. especially cooks who are very powerful, figuratively speaking, to spice things up to your detrimental outcome. So what I mean by that is if you have a organization with too many org admins, so a cloud term, site admins, org admins, those are very powerful roles, and they can basically do anything in your organization, right? They can add users, they can remove users, they can add and delete groups, which could be catastrophic. They, by virtue of being an org admin, they can also the full product admin responsibility. So you want to be mindful as to who has what admin role in your organization, in your Jira or GSM instance or Confluence instance. You really want to think this through. And those people who are admins, they need to be obviously knowing what they're doing. They need to be trained up. They need to be enabled. They really need to be very solid in the product because with a few little switches, things can really get haywire very quickly. So my recommendation on that question, what are some of the things that you should really avoid from a governance perspective, is make sure that you have the right people who are in admin roles, and make sure that you do not have too many people in those admin roles. All right, looking at the chat again, if there were any questions, thank you so much, Brianna, for posting some of the content that I referred to. Much appreciated. Looking if there are any more questions. I think there were no more questions that were asked. So with that, I want to sincerely thank you for attending today. Really appreciate it. Governance is a great topic, and a topic that you can probably tell I'm very passionate about. And again, if we can be of help to you, we would be delighted to play a role in the organization establishing a solid governance model. So stay in touch. All the best. Good night, good evening, wherever you are, and hopefully see you on a webinar in the not so distant future. Wishing everyone a great day. Thank you so much.